Terminal B at LAX buzzed with the usual symphony of suitcase wheels, soft flight announcements, and overpriced coffee. In the first-class line, where platinum cards flashed and Italian leather shoes gleamed, a man in a faded jacket stood quietly, unnoticed, Keanu Reeves. He wore a weathered brown jacket whose original color had faded into something rich and storied, like the patina on well-loved furniture. His jeans showed the wear of real use, not the factory-distressed kind made to look rugged. The hiking boots on his feet were scuffed in places that told of real journeys, not Instagram adventures. A patched backpack hung from one shoulder, speaking of a man who repairs rather than replaces. Not a single designer logo marked him anywhere. Yet Keanu emanated a quiet gravity that created a pocket of stillness amid the airport chaos. While others frantically checked phones and watches, his hands remained empty, his posture calm. He simply existed in the moment, observing the human theater around him with the gentle curiosity of someone who had long ago stopped trying to impress anyone but himself. Two people behind him stood: Graham Cutler, a man whose entire existence was a carefully curated statement. His steel blue suit had been tailored in Milan to emphasize power. His watch, a limited edition timepiece whose waiting list was longer than most marriages, caught the fluorescent light at calculated angles. His hand-crafted Italian loafers had never known a puddle. Even his posture communicated privilege, the slight tilt of his chin suggesting someone accustomed to looking down at the world rather than meeting its gaze. Graham lived as if invisible cameras were constantly documenting his life for a success story documentary. Every item he wore, every gesture he made was filtered through a single question: will this reinforce my status? As the line inched forward with that special kind of airport slowness, Graham's perfect facade began to crack. His eyes flicked between his watch and the shabby figure ahead, his jaw tightening with each passing minute. The very existence of someone so clearly unstylish in his exclusive space felt like a personal affront, as if someone had hung a thrift store painting in a gallery of masterpieces. The cognitive dissonance made his skin itch. "I'm all for being inclusive, but I didn't realize they were letting folks in straight from REI," Graham finally said, his voice calibrated to carry just far enough that those nearby could hear his witticism without him appearing to be directly confrontational. It was the verbal equivalent of a subtly raised eyebrow, plausibly deniable yet unmistakable in its elitist intent. Keanu turned, his eyes meeting Graham's with unexpected directness. There was no defensiveness in them, no embarrassment, not even a flicker of annoyance, just a calm awareness that seemed to take in Graham's expensive suit and carefully constructed image without attaching any particular importance to it. "Could be," Keanu replied, his voice carrying the gentle gravel of authenticity. "Life does have a sense of humor." The response caught Graham off guard. He had anticipated embarrassment or perhaps defensive anger, the typical reactions his carefully aimed social barbs usually provoked. Instead, he received equanimity, and something about that unruffled response unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "I mean, no offense," Graham continued, the disclaimer transparently insincere, "but I'm just not used to sharing this line with campers." He emphasized the last word with a slight curl of his lip, as if referring to something unpleasant he'd found on the bottom of his expensive shoe. The comment landed like a small grenade in the civilized space. Several passengers glanced over, some wincing at the naked elitism, others leaning in with the guilty pleasure of witnessing someone else's discomfort. A woman in Chanel pretended to check her boarding pass while drinking in every word. A middle-aged executive actually paused his very important call to listen, his eyebrows rising in anticipation of conflict. If you were in Keanu's position right now, would you, 1. Stay silent and smile, or 2. Respond immediately? Comment your choice below. Keanu smiled, not the thin, defensive smile of someone trying to save face, but something genuine and surprisingly warm that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Sometimes campers take the scenic route to get here," he said, his voice carrying a gentle wisdom that made Graham's comments suddenly sound small and hollow. Before Graham could formulate a response that would reassert the social hierarchy he was so invested in maintaining, a gate agent announced the beginning of boarding procedures. The first-class passengers began to move forward, presenting their boarding passes and identification with the practiced efficiency of frequent travelers. As Graham handed his credentials to the gate agent, he couldn't resist leaning slightly closer and saying, "Frequent flyer global premier status," with just enough volume to ensure those nearby would register his position in the travel aristocracy. His tone carried the unmistakable subtext, "I belong here, unlike some people." The gate agent, a woman whose professional smile had been honed through thousands of interactions with men exactly like Graham, barely looked up from her scanner. "Thank you, Mr. Cutler. You're in seat 1B. Her flat tone suggested she'd seen this performance countless times before, and it hadn't grown more impressive with repetition. Graham proceeded down the jet bridge with the confident stride of someone entering a space they believe rightfully belongs to them. He nodded curtly to the flight attendant, greeting passengers at the aircraft door, already mentally settling into the exclusive comfort of the premium cabin. But when he stepped into the first-class section, his face twitched, the polished mask slipping for the first time. There, already settling into seat 1A, was the man in the weathered jacket. Keanu looked up, meeting Graham's gaze with quiet recognition. "We meet again," he said simply. Graham exhaled sharply, the sound carrying more emotion than he would have liked to reveal. "Unreal," he muttered, the single word laden with disbelief. The universe, it seemed, had a particular sense of irony or perhaps justice that Graham found intensely uncomfortable. He deposited his briefcase in the overhead compartment with deliberate care, taking far more time than necessary to adjust his suit jacket before finally lowering himself into the seat adjacent to the man he had just attempted to humiliate. The proximity was now inescapable, the premium cabin suddenly feeling much smaller than its spacious design suggested. The silence between them stretched, growing denser with each passing second until Graham felt compelled to break it, if only to establish some semblance of control over the situation. "So, what do you do?" he asked, his tone artificially casual while his eyes remained sharp and assessing. The question wasn't born of genuine interest but was instead a fishing expedition, a way to confirm his assumptions about the misplaced passenger beside him. Keanu finished securing his seatbelt before answering, his movements unhurried. "I'm in the film industry," he said, the simplicity of the statement offering no elaboration, no defense, no bid for validation. "Oh yeah?" Graham's expression brightened with poorly concealed condescension. "Behind-the-scenes stuff? Or like indie documentaries?" "Something like that," Keanu replied, neither correcting the assumption nor offering additional information that might clarify his actual status. Graham settled back into his seat, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Interesting how folks find their way up here," he said, gesturing vaguely at the premium cabin. "Guess first class isn't what it used to be." The comment hung in the air between them, its intended sting obvious. But rather than rising to the bait, Keanu turned toward the window, his profile outlined against the tarmac beyond the glass. "Depends what you think it's for," he said quietly, the words carrying no defensiveness, only a gentle questioning of assumptions. As the remaining passengers filed past toward the main cabin, Graham found himself increasingly irritated by his seatmate's imperturbable calm. There was something profoundly unsettling about a person who seemed genuinely untouched by the social weapons Graham had spent a lifetime honing. The pre-flight routine proceeded with choreographed efficiency safety demonstrations performed to the indifference of frequent flyers, final checks completed by the cabin crew, the subtle shift in engine noise as the aircraft prepared for departure. Through it all, Keanu remained present in a way that Graham found almost offensive, not checking a phone or a watch, not signaling importance through visible impatience, just existing in the moment with apparent contentment. Once they reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign dimmed, the welcome service began. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced grace, their professional smiles unwavering as they prepared to deliver the premium experience that justified the considerable price difference between cabins. When they reached row 1, Graham straightened imperceptibly and put on the charming smile he reserved for service staff when others were watching. "I'll have a glass of your Dom Perignon," he said with a casual flourish that nonetheless communicated his familiarity with luxury. "Might as well start the journey properly." The attendant nodded and turned to Keanu. "And for you, sir?" "Still water would be perfect, thank you," Keanu replied, his smile reaching his eyes in a way that acknowledged the human being behind the professional role. Graham couldn't resist the opening. "Water? Man, come on," he said with exaggerated disbelief. "We're flying high, live a little. They don't stock the good stuff back in economy." Keanu accepted the bottle of water from the attendant with a quiet thank you. "Sometimes, peace is worth more than perks," he replied, twisting the cap with unhurried movements. The statement landed in the space between them, simple yet somehow profound in its implicit challenge to Graham's value system. Around them, other passengers began to take notice of the exchange, their attention drawn by the subtle tension emanating from the front row. A woman seated diagonally across the aisle lowered her novel slightly, her eyes tracking the interaction while pretending to read. A businessman in the second row paused his scrolling, his thumb hovering above his phone screen. Graham leaned closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was, in reality, perfectly audible to those nearby. "You know, people who talk about simplicity are usually the ones who couldn't afford the alternative," he said, the statement weighted with assumptions about worth and value. Keanu's gaze shifted slightly toward him, his expression neither offended nor defensive. "Or maybe they already tried the alternative," he suggested quietly. "And found it wasn't worth the cost." The clinking of glasses from a nearby service tray punctuated the moment, the silence that followed heavy with unspoken implications. Several passengers now watched openly, the in-flight entertainment momentarily forgotten in favor of the real human drama unfolding before them. Have you ever judged someone based solely on their appearance, only to discover how wrong you were? If you're willing, share that story in the comments. The tension in the air was palpable. Keanu sat with the patient dignity of someone who had nothing to prove, while Graham seemed increasingly agitated by this unexpected challenge to his worldview. "You really believe that?" Graham asked, his tone somewhere between genuine curiosity and defensive challenge. "I've met people who have everything," Keanu replied, his voice carrying the weight of experience rather than judgment. "And still feel like they're missing something." Graham straightened, an instinctive physical assertion of status. "Not me," he said with undisguised pride. "I've earned every bit of what I've got. Worked for it. Sacrificed. People like me deserve this," he added, gesturing at the premium cabin around them. Keanu nodded slowly, acknowledging Graham's perspective without agreeing with it. "Then maybe what matters is how you use what you've earned," he suggested, the words offered not as a counterattack but as a gentle redirection. Graham felt his face flush slightly, the physical manifestation of an emotion he wasn't accustomed to experiencing. "You saying I don't?" he challenged, the question sharper than he intended. Keanu didn't rise to the confrontational tone. "I'm saying, some people build towers to look down. Others build bridges to lift others up," he replied, his voice remaining even and thoughtful. Though not spoken loudly, the words seemed to resonate through the cabin. One of the attendants paused mid-pour at a nearby row, her professional mask momentarily slipping to reveal genuine contemplation of the exchange. Graham scoffed, but those watching closely might have noticed the slight twitch in his jaw, a tell of discomfort he was unaware of revealing. "You talk like a monk," he said dismissively. "But in the real world, status is power. Keanu looked directly at him now, his gaze steady but not confrontational. "And in the real world, compassion is what's remembered," he said simply. The social balance of the cabin had subtly shifted. The man in the second row nodded almost imperceptibly, as if in private agreement. The woman with the novel had abandoned all pretense of reading, her attention now fully engaged with the philosophical duel playing out before her. Even a flight attendant passing by slowed her pace, glancing toward the exchange with undisguised interest. Graham felt the shift like a physical change in air pressure. Somehow, despite every external marker of status favoring him, he was losing ground in this invisible contest. The realization stoked a defensive anger he struggled to contain. "What are you, some kind of motivational speaker?" he jabbed, the question deliberately reductive. "No," Keanu answered with the same unruffled calm he'd maintained throughout. "Just someone who's seen a lot." It could have ended there, a philosophical impasse between strangers who would part ways at their destination, never to cross paths again. But something in Graham couldn't allow that. Perhaps it was the watching eyes of the other passengers, or perhaps it was something deeper, a crack in the foundation of certainty upon which he had built his identity. "You act like you're above all this," he pressed, his voice tightening. "Like you're better than me." Keanu shook his head slightly, his expression suggesting not superiority but a kind of compassionate understanding. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," he said. "I just try to treat people like they matter. No matter what they're wearing. Or what seat they're in." The tension in the cabin had grown palpable, the usual white noise of air travel giving way to an attentive hush. Then, into this charged silence, a quiet but clear voice intervened. "Mr. Reeves," said a flight attendant as she approached their row. "The captain sends his regards and confirms your transfer in Tokyo will be arranged as requested." For a moment, time itself seemed suspended. Then, like a wave breaking against stone, whispers began to ripple through the cabin. Graham blinked rapidly, his brain struggling to process the information that had just been casually dropped into their conversation. "Wait. Reeves," he repeated, his voice suddenly smaller. "Keanu Reeves." A woman nearby spoke the name just loudly enough to be heard, her tone carrying wonder and confirmation simultaneously. Keanu nodded politely in acknowledgement, his demeanor unchanged as if his identity were a minor detail rather than a revelation that had just transformed the entire social dynamic of the cabin. Graham felt the blood drain from his face, a cold realization washing over him. The carefully constructed facade of superiority he had been projecting crumbled in an instant, replaced by the dawning horror of recognition. "You didn't say, I had no idea," he stammered, words failing him for perhaps the first time in his adult life. "You asked what I do," Keanu reminded him gently. "Not who I am." The distinction hung in the air between them, profound in its simplicity. Graham fumbled for a response, his usual arsenal of social tactics suddenly useless. "I didn't mean, I wouldn't have said." "I know," Keanu interrupted, his tone not accusatory but understanding. "But maybe that's the point." More murmurs rippled through the cabin now, a subtle tide of recognition washing from row to row. The very people whose admiration Graham had silently courted with his expensive suit and confident demeanor were now regarding him with expressions that ranged from second-hand embarrassment to outright disapproval. The social currency he valued so highly had devalued in minutes, while the quiet man in the weathered jacket had revealed wealth of a different kind. Do you think Graham feels genuine remorse, or is he just embarrassed because Keanu is famous? Comment 1 for genuine remorse, or 2 for temporary embarrassment. Graham sat in stunned silence, experiencing an emotion he hadn't felt since childhood, genuine shame. Not the performative contrition of corporate apologies or the strategic regret of professional setbacks, but the raw, unfiltered recognition of having been fundamentally wrong not just in his assessment of his seatmate, but in the values that had led to that assessment. "I'm sorry," he said at last, the words emerging with surprising difficulty. His voice cracked slightly, betraying an authenticity he rarely allowed himself to display. "Not because you're you, but because I was wrong." Keanu regarded him thoughtfully, his expression neither triumphant nor condemning. "That takes more strength than most realize," he said after a moment, the words carrying no trace of condescension. "Have you ever judged someone, only to realize how wrong you were? Share your story in the comments." The meal service began, providing a welcome structural interruption to the intensity of the moment. They ate mostly in silence, the usual performative small talk of first-class travel rendered unnecessary by the genuine exchange that had preceded it. Graham found himself watching his seatmate with new awareness, noticing how Keanu thanked each flight attendant by name, how he listened with genuine interest when an elderly passenger stopped to share a story on her way back from the lavatory, how he declined a second dessert but suggested it be offered to a child a few rows back who had been eyeing it longingly. None of these actions appeared calculated for effect or observation. There was no performance, no glancing around to ensure his kindness had witnesses. His actions flowed naturally from a person whose values weren't situational but intrinsic, applied equally whether cameras were rolling or no one was watching, whether to those who could further his career or those who could offer him nothing in return. In a world obsessed with being seen, Keanu seemed concerned only with seeing others. As the flight progressed, Graham found himself sinking into an unfamiliar state of reflection. The narrative he had constructed about himself, validated by his financial success, professional achievements, and carefully curated image, suddenly felt as thin as a designer's shirt. Questions he had buried beneath acquisitions and achievements began to surface with uncomfortable clarity. What was the actual value of the status he pursued so relentlessly? If he stripped away the watch, the suit, the elite memberships, what remained of the man beneath? Had he spent his life building something worth living, or merely something worth envying? And the most disturbing question of all, if he treated people based solely on their appearance or perceived status, how many Keanu Reeveses had he dismissed along the way? How many meaningful connections had he sacrificed at the altar of his own superiority? These uncomfortable thoughts accompanied him as the plane began its descent toward Tokyo, the captain's voice announcing their approach to Narita International Airport. Outside the window, the sprawling metropolis came into view, a tapestry of light and structure that somehow mirrored Graham's interior landscape, impressive from a distance but revealing its true complexity only upon closer inspection. As the wheels touched down and the aircraft slowed on the runway, Graham remained uncharacteristically still, mentally replaying the encounter that had somehow penetrated defenses he hadn't even recognized he'd built. When the seatbelt sign dimmed and passengers began to gather their belongings, Keanu retrieved his weathered backpack from beneath the seat with the same unhurried movements that had characterized his entire demeanor. He nodded politely to the cabin crew, exchanging brief but genuine farewells with those he had interacted with during the flight. A few passengers approached him discreetly, offering handshakes and expressing admiration with a kind of quiet reverence that struck Graham as fundamentally different from the attention-seeking celebrity interactions he was accustomed to witnessing. Keanu received each person with the same attentive presence he had demonstrated throughout the flight, not rushing, not performing, simply connecting in the moment before moving on. And then he was gone, absorbed into the stream of travelers flowing toward customs and connections, carrying no more outward markers of his success than he had when Graham first dismissed him in the boarding line. Graham remained seated long after most passengers had departed, ostensibly organizing his briefcase but actually processing an experience that had somehow punctured the carefully constructed bubble of his worldview. A flight attendant approached, her professional smile tinged with genuine concern. "Everything all right, Mr. Cutler? Can I assist you with anything before we prepare for the next flight?" Graham looked up, seeing her, truly seeing the human being behind the role perhaps for the first time. "No, thank you," he said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar softness. "I'm just taking a moment." She nodded, recognizing something in his expression that transcended the usual passenger-crew dynamic. "Take all the time you need," she said gently, before moving on to her other responsibilities. Later that week, back in Los Angeles, Graham found himself standing in line at the coffee shop near his office building. The morning rush had created the usual tension of impatient professionals, each person absorbed in their own importance, the collective humanity of the moment reduced to obstacles in individual journeys. Ahead of him stood a man in paint-stained work clothes, his hands rough from manual labor, his boots covered in the dust of construction sites. As he reached the counter, he pulled out a handful of coins, counting them carefully with calloused fingers. "Sorry," he muttered to the barista, his embarrassment palpable. "Think I'm $1 short. Let me just get a small instead." In the past, Graham would have sighed audibly, checked his watch with exaggerated impatience, perhaps even made a cutting remark to the stranger beside him about people who held up lines. The script was familiar, the response automatic. But today, something different happened. Graham stepped forward without hesitation. "It's on me today, man," he said, placing his premium credit card on the counter. "Get whatever you were going to order." The man turned, surprise giving way to cautious gratitude. "You sure? That's really kind of you." "Yeah," Graham replied, meeting the man's eyes directly. "I've had a educational week. Consider it me paying something forward." The man smiled a genuine expression that transformed his tired face. "Thanks. I've had a rough one. This actually means a lot." "Yeah," Graham said, his gaze drifting toward the door as if looking beyond it to something only he could see. "I know the feeling." When they had both received their orders, the man raised his cup in a small toast of appreciation before heading out. Graham watched him go, experiencing an unfamiliar sensation that took him a moment to identify: connection. Not networking, not strategic relationship building, but simple human acknowledgement across the artificial boundaries of class and circumstance. Outside, the California sunshine illuminated the street with a clarity that seemed somehow new. Graham paused on the sidewalk, briefcase in one hand, coffee in the other, the weight of his watch on his wrist suddenly noticeable in a way it hadn't been before. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was fully present in the moment, not planning his next achievement, not calculating his social position, not performing success for an invisible audience, but simply existing in the flow of life around him. And in that ordinary moment on an ordinary street, Graham understood something that would subtly reshape every interaction that followed: true first class isn't about where you sit. It's about how you show up. Do you believe true success is about what you display, or how you treat others? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your story.